Our speaker today knows a lot about the world of missions in the 19th century. In 2003, Dr. Gibson earned his bachelor's degree in archaeology from Columbia University. In 2006, he earned a Master's of Arts degree in church history from Yale Divinity School. In 2016, he earned a doctorate in history from Emory University. In 2006, he began to work for over 3 years as an assistant head of collections management at Columbia University Libraries. In 2016, he began work for over 4 years as a librarian of history in Jewish studies and religious studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. And since October of 2022, he has been librarian of special collections at Yale Divinity School. After George Edward Day started building a missions library at Yale in the late 19th century, it quickly became one of the best in the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Libson.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to talk with you about congregational activism between the end of the Civil War and the start of the Great Depression. So historians often like to talk about the past as being a foreign country. And you can start to see pretty quickly why that might be. People talk differently, they dress differently. And like any good metaphor, the more you dig into it, the kind of more it makes sense, the better it sounds to you, right? Any of you who have spent a lot of time in a place that's different from where you grew up, you start to see that there are little intricacies, right, that start to make more sense to you, right? That the way that people move might be different, right? And then when people come to visit, you know, they might point out something that they see as different, and they don't understand it, but they might make assumptions about it, right? And you're like, no, actually, that, you know, the reason why they're doing this thing is not what you're thinking it is, but it's for some other reason, right? So the past is a foreign country kind of gets at a lot of also a lot of the issues, a lot of the mistakes that people read into the past, right? There's anachronism, not understanding the order in which something perceived. There's reading the present onto the past, assuming things have stayed the same way that they've always been, right? We often think of that in terms of like the built environment, right? You see a road goes through here and you sort of just assume that the road always went by that house or that street, right? There's a lack of context, right? Not understanding all the intricacies that go into an event that happened to occur. And then there's also the fact that even if you know all of the different events, you know, the order in which something occurred, you might not understand necessarily why it happened, how it happened, etc., right? Knowing the details doesn't necessarily give you all the information you need. And so what historians do, what I'm hoping to do today, is we try to make an argument about the past, right? It's not necessarily just that it's a series of events, but that there's some way to understand it. And that way is debatable. You can disagree with the point that I'm trying to make today, right? And so what I'm going to try to say, and this is a little bit speculative because I'm actually a historian of missions specifically rather than a historian of Congregationalism. But what I'd like to argue is that a lot of the issues that we are going to be talking about today, and specifically I'm going to focus on Congregationalism and labor, the conflict between religion and labor, and Congregationalism in the world, this is the issue of missions, essentially. What I'm going to try to argue is that an understanding of congregational polity and theology, maybe a move back to more traditional concepts of congregational polity and theology, a little bit of what Mike was talking about in the sort of like early 19th century and pre-revolutionary period. This idea that church is a covenant, that the church comes together to make a promise amongst one another that they will support one another and build up the community, that that both possibly created more conflict and or could have been the solution to the conflict, right? So in some ways, it's going both directions. Sort of narrowly interpreting the concept of community, of congregation, promoted additional conflict in these two issues that I'd like to talk about. So, if you can see this is kind of my overview of what I'd like to talk about today. As I said, I want to discuss the issues of activism in the church and the church in the world. But first, I'd like to give us a little bit of a reminder of this time period, right? This is a huge period of time, and there's no way that I'm going to be able to cover all of the aspects of these two huge topics in and of themselves. Then we'll talk for hopefully about 10 minutes about Congregationalism and labor. I know more about missions, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about missions. I'll have a conclusion, and then I'm hoping that we can have some time for question and answer and discussion at the end. So, 1865, okay? You're probably not going to be able to understand this image on the lower right here, but I'll explain it to you in a moment. 1865 was a huge moment in American history. The Civil War was obviously a cataclysmic event in the country's history. The population in 1860 had just topped 30 million for the first time, 10% of that being the property of another human being. Historical demographers have recently upped the estimate for the number of people killed during the Civil War. It was previously about 620,000, the estimate, and now it's closer to 700,000. In the North, that was about 1 in 20 young white men. In the South, it was 1 in 8 of military age. Many more returned home missing limbs, all sorts of other kind of terrible trauma that they experienced. For formerly enslaved people, it was a moment of new hope, right? I mean, there was the possibility of going to school, of voting, of earning money, of serving on juries, holding public office. Eric Foner, who's a well-regarded historian from Columbia University, has described Reconstruction as a, quote, radical departure, a stunning and unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy. There's so much more that one could say about it, but in the interest of time, let's leave it there. In demographic terms, the country changed radically in the period between 1865 and 1930. Plenty of people had immigrated to the United States before the Civil War, but nothing like what happened after the Civil War. Except for a few sparse Anglo settlements, the West was essentially Indian country, and California, in 1864, contributed as many electoral votes as my home state of Vermont. The ways that all these people experienced life also changed in some pretty fundamental ways. The trip from New York to San Francisco took more than a month in 1865, which was a great improvement over a few decades earlier, but nowhere near the bullet train experience of the 83-hour transcontinental railroad, right? And that's a little bit of what this map on the side here is saying. All of these lines are indicative of the amount of time it would take to travel from New York City to another location, right? And so you can see in the image on the left, first of all, you're barely getting halfway across the country, and second of all, this right here is 6 weeks, okay? So 6 weeks doesn't even appear on the other slide. We could also talk about education being different. Universities essentially didn't exist in the period before the Civil War. The idea of the German research university model is something that came about in the late 19th century. All of the professional organizations, the American Bar Association, the American Medical Association, et cetera, they all kind of start to exist in the late 19th century. In church life, this is a period where denominations are starting to come together for all sorts of reasons. To work together on things. And so some of what I'll talk about today is not necessarily particular to Congregationalism, but Congregationalists were participating in the same sort of activity as others. And let's not forget that this was not the American century, okay? The main focus of economic power was London at this time. China and India had much larger economies than the United States. Even France and Germany had about the same size economy, but with much, much smaller populations. So let's jump ahead to 1930. And maybe I'll say a word about the images on the slides. I tried to use as many images from the Yale Library collection as I possibly could, because that'll allow me, if you want to have a discussion afterwards about any of these, I'd be happy to do so. Our collection focuses heavily on the history of missionaries, and especially missionaries to China. And so a lot of the images that you'll see, if you can read the small text at the bottom, which you might not be able to, a lot of them will indicate something related to China, and that's why. So in 1929, when the stock market crashed, a baby who was born in 1865 would have turned 64. They would have turned 67 by the time the market bottomed out in 1932. That person's lifetime would have included inventions like the automobile, like radio, like the telephone, electricity, essentially. In 1920 is the first year in American history that, or the first census year in American history, where more people lived in an area that was defined as an urban area than a rural area. An urban area, my small town that I grew up in Vermont, which had a few thousand people, that would have been defined as an urban area. 1,500 people was what was classified as urban, right? So America was incredibly rural for a very long period of time, but that started to change in the late 19th century with all of this immigration. All of the states had finally come together by 1912, in the continental US. But now we've also incorporated places like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the Philippines, etc. The growth of the geography of the United States matched the growth on the world stage. Industrialization prompted a huge growth in the US economy, and also, consequently, a lot of strife between capital and labor, which we'll talk about in just a moment. In other words, a lot had changed. And we know that change is inevitable, but history also tells us that change often leads to some sort of conflict. Someone feels aggrieved over how that change occurred, right? And so we will be talking about that. Let's also, I picked this time period because it's the one that I study. But 1865 happens to also have been an incredibly important year for the Congregational Church, okay? We know from what Mike said, and I think from what you've learned in previous versions of this lecture series, that Congregationalism is really founded on the belief in the congregation coming together in covenant with one another and with God, right? And it was founded, as Mike said, as a dissenting religion, right? And in colonial America and in Great Britain, that was not necessary. I mean, in colonial America, it was for the most part okay. In Great Britain, it was not okay, right? It essentially meant that you were denying the supremacy of the monarch as the head of the Church of England, right? And that is usually not a good idea, to deny a monarch their supremacy, right? But as time passed in the United States became a country, and Congregationalism grew and other Protestant denominations grew, there increasingly needed to be some way for churches to work together, right? And so in 1865, the Congregational churches, right? It's a denomination, but it's not really, it hasn't really come together in formal settings, other than through organizations like the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. In 1865, though, they meet in Boston, and they pass a declaration of faith. And this is sort of the first time in a very long time that Congregationalism comes together in order to establish something that they say, we're all going to kind of agree on, right? And yet, at first, they couldn't agree on it, right? Because the word Calvinism was in it. And people were like, well, sure, we believe in Calvinism, but we're not sure we can use the word Calvinism, right? And so the result of this is that essentially somebody comes up with an alternative declaration that has all the Calvinist stuff in it, but we don't use the word Calvinism. And they're like, okay, we can agree on that, right? And so that's kind of a huge step forward in terms of the denomination becoming more sort of formally organized. And 6 years later, they're able to establish that in an even more kind of concrete form. So at that 1865 meeting, they established the National Congregational Council, which essentially raised money for the sort of expansion of Congregationalism. But in 1871, they established the National Council of the Congregational Churches of the United States. And this is still a moment in which churches, the independence of churches is sort of primary, right? It's the main kind of organizing principle. And yet they wanted to find ways that we can say, okay, but we all agree on this, and we all want to kind of serve this function, this purpose, this goal, et cetera, right? And so this council comes together, and they basically they give advice, right, to churches who want it. Okay. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I put together a slide of this. And so on the left side here is this Declaration of Faith. It's called the Beacon Hill Declaration of Faith. That's the text that kind of leaves out the word Calvinism. And on the right here is an image of Andover Theological School. I raise Andover because Andover has a sort of, it's like a feeder school for Congregationalist ministers, and especially people who want to become missionaries. Okay, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay, so Congregationalism and labor, and I'm already a little bit behind schedule. So this is kind of the order that I'd like to discuss this topic with you. Concerns from the clergy, responses from congregations, and whether this is kind of like a bottom-up or top-down kind of history. The image on the screen here, if you can see it, it's from Life magazine. The title of it is Life's Sunday School. And above the little kids there, you see Thou Shalt Not Steal. Okay? And the people on the bench, I'm fairly sure you can't read the names on the bottom there, but it's essentially all of these, it's infantilized versions of the sort of like people you would associate with being the robber barons of the late 19th century, right? It is Rockefeller, Carnegie, et cetera, right? So you can see Andrew Carnegie is, I think they call him Andy Carnegie, and he is on the far right there, right? So they're on the principal's, at the principal's desk. And actually, sorry, I have this text only on the computer. In Life magazine itself, explaining this slide, it said, quote, stealing is a great sin and very naughty. It should not be indulged in by the majority of people. And then upon life's further questioning, so this is them asking the kids about stealing, right? So they're saying it's very naughty and most people should not do it. But upon life's further questioning, Rockefeller clarified that God occasionally, quote, chooses one person who may take from the others all he can get because he's consecrated to the service of the Lord, and he's wise and good and smart enough to know what to do with it, right?
What was the date?
That is 1905. Thank you. I knew I had it there somewhere. 1905, yes. And not coincidentally, 1905 is a key moment for some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about later, and that's how I sort of came upon this issue relating to the American Board. So remember the date, 1905. Okay. In the interest of saving time, I'm just going to say that this was the period that we're talking about was a huge moment of conflict between capital and between labor, partly due to the sort of increase in immigration, but really largely because industries were sort of starting to explode across the United States, and especially in cities, right? And so you had, railway workers, you had people making farm equipment, all sorts of things, right, that increasingly is becoming de-skilled, right? Where previously somebody making, farm equipment or something, right, they would have needed to develop some sort of skill in order to do that, right? And their labor was somehow valued. And increasingly it's becoming unnecessary to have those skills, right? Because you're kind of along a shop floor, right? And now you have managers who are overseeing you and making sure you're doing the right work, right? But also it's a period of time when the idea of like macroeconomics that we come to know in the second half of the 20th century is not at all there, right? There's really very little control over the broad economic structure of the country. And so you have regular boom and bust cycles. And so there was a major depression in 1873 that was largely caused by the US going on to the gold standard, but also other factors. And this depression ostensibly technically lasted a decade, okay? So first of all, a decade is a long time. But because this was a boom and bust cycle, it sort of fed into other depressions that immediately followed it, the most significant of which was the Panic of 1893. And so essentially, for 25 or so years, the country is in this depression. And these days, you would sort of hope that your employer, maybe some people would be laid off in a depression, maybe, your employer wouldn't give you raises during a depression or a recession. The responses to workers during these depressions were wage cuts of 25%, right? And these are people who are already making very, very little money. And so this leads to all sorts of protests. And at the same time, this is a period when there are essentially no laws kind of protecting laborers, right? And so companies like Carnegie's company, they had their own police service that could shoot people, if they were striking, right? And that was essentially not, no one did anything about that, right? So, I mean, this is a huge period of strife within the labor market, within the American labor. Okay. So I'm going to be using kind of two books to frame this topic of Congregationalism and labor. And I brought them, so maybe I'll grab them. So one is this book called Union Made by Heath Carter. and another is called The Gospel of Church by Janine Giordano Drake. These are two young scholars, two young historians, and their books sort of speak to one another. So if you're interested in either of these books, I'd be happy to show them to you so that you can jot down the name. Okay. So, clerical concerns is our first topic. As I've already mentioned, this is a period of sort of massive changes where people are increasingly moving to cities, and there's an increasingly large percentage of people who are immigrants. It's also a period, though, when the churches, Congregationalists included, are more and more frightened of cities, of city life, right? They view it as dens of sin, right? So Henry Kelsey wrote in The Home Missionary, which was the publication of the Congregational Home Missionary Society. He wrote, "Every peril to our country and civilization is focused in the city. The foreigner is there en masse. Wealth is there, piled 20 stories high, and its associated mammon worship. The saloon is there, socialism, anarchy, crime, and vice, and boss politics flourish. Streams of moral health or of disease flow out over the land from our great cities. While some of the best Christian work, some of the most aggressive evangelistic preaching and church life is in the cities, most of the best work of the devil is done there." Ironically, almost every denomination also had their main headquarters in the city as well. So, the Congregationalists were based on Beacon Street from the 1870s on, and that's still where the Congregational Library and Archives is based. It's based in the same building that they constructed in the 1890s. Presbyterians had offices in New York and in Philadelphia. All of these denominations were also in the cities. So the image on the screen here, you'll see is of Luther Halsey Gulick. And the quote, in case you can't read it, is, "The future of the country depends upon its young men, and largely upon the young men of the cities. If I want to interest young men, I do not go to the prayer meeting because young men are not, as a rule, found in prayer meetings. The young men are to be found in our ball grounds, in our bowling alleys, in our gymnasia." So Gulick, first of all, is the son of American-born missionaries. He was born in Hawaii, so he was from this well-established Congregationalist family. He himself did not find sort of great pleasure in the ministry himself, and eventually, he attended Oberlin College. Eventually, he became highly interested in athletics, and he was hired by the YMCA, and he sort of worked for them in Springfield, Massachusetts. His most famous student, was the person who invented basketball, right? And so. So this is a picture, I hope you can see it because it's this phenomenal image of him. And he's the one in the middle there. It's this phenomenal image of him surrounded by all of these men, in very interesting poses, let's say, but holding on to all sorts of sports equipment, right? And so because this is a period of time where the idea of how do you get people interested in religion, especially men, how do you do it? You do it through things that men are supposed to enjoy, right? It's through sports. It's through, the great outdoors. The term that has come into use for this period is muscular Christianity. So, And so if you've been to a church or a synagogue, I'm Jewish. My synagogue was built in the 1930s. We had a big basketball court right behind the sanctuary. Yale Divinity School, when it was built in the 1930s, had a gym in the back of it. That's now where the Center for Faith and Culture is. My area in special collections, there used to be squash courts, right? There was this idea that in order to not tempt young men to going to saloons, to going to prostitutes, that you needed to find other things for them to do, right? But what this is also getting at is the fact that ministers were looking out in their congregation, and for some reason, for the first time in history, realizing that it's mostly women in the crowd, right? And that's actually been true of churches for time immemorial, right? That Anne Broad, who's a historian, famously wrote this article called Religious History is Women's History, essentially saying that you can't separate these two things from one another, largely because of the fact that women have been the backbone of American religion, again, from time immemorial. But ministers were apparently started to realize this in the late 19th century, and they got scared to death that they were losing all these working class men, right? Another main figure in Congregationalism who kind of falls into the same category is a man named Josiah Strong. So Josiah Strong wrote a book called Our Country in 1898, maybe? No, 1885. That was essentially making all of the same critiques that I've just mentioned. He's scared about city life. He wants more men coming into the church. He particularly is worried about the rise of Mormonism and the rise of Catholicism, right? Many of the immigrants coming to the United States were Catholic. But Josiah Strong, I bring him up in particular because he is an example of another trend which focused on finding social scientific ways to respond to this issue of men not coming to church and of these problems in the city, right? And that was also a trend for this period. So Strong helped found the League for Social Service, which is one of these organizations that basically, the way that historians have traditionally thought of it is as a sort of form of social control, right? Going out and like identifying problems in the city and saying like, this is what you need to do in order to solve it, right? And so there's all sorts of different ways in which Congregationalists are responding to this problem, but it's identified in any case as a problem. Okay. Responses from the congregation. So everyone that I've mentioned up until this point has been essentially a minister, a pastor, and I think for the most part all Congregationalists. So there's been a tendency to associate the labor movement, laborers, as socialists, right? As Marxists, as fully buying into this idea that religion is the opiate of the masses, right? And that people like Eugene Debs, who is the socialist leader, would have been totally opposed to religion, right? And that all of these striking workers were totally opposed to religion. Actually, that's not really the case. And this is sort of the main argument. Both books make this point, but it's sort of a main argument of this book, Union Made. Union Made is making the case that it's not just that's wrong, but that congregations pushed clerical leadership towards a position where they cared more about social justice issues. And that is, I can't think of anything that's sort of more Congregationalist, right, than the congregation kind of coming together and working out this issue amongst themselves. Right, similar to you all having your meeting in 2 weeks, which you apparently should attend, about about your budget and stuff, right? I mean, it's like you have to decide on this together. But what I have on the screen here are actually two very, very different perspectives, right? So the image here, hoodwinking clergymen, that's actually from C.W. Post, Charles Post, who was the founder of Post Cereal, right? Already an incredibly wealthy man at this point in time. And what he is writing here is basically saying, so the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, had asked churches to have a labor Sunday where labor leaders would be allowed to go into churches and basically make the case for why labor and Christianity overlap in many different ways, right? And why the congregation should be supportive of laborers. Post did not like this at all, right? And so he's saying here, the hoodwinking clergymen are clergymen who are basically being consumed by this argument that they should listen to the laborers in their congregation. And he's saying, no. Andrew Cameron, on the other hand, is talking about what, and I learned this word from Janine's book, what he's talking about is churchianity, right? Churchianity is a term actually of the time period, and it's a worship of the church, right? Not a worship of Christ or of Christianity, a worship of the church. And so this quotation comes from this publication called The Working Man's Advocate, and he was responding to an article by the Congregationalist minister William W. Patton, who had 2 days earlier written to say that the supreme ruler of all has assigned workers their place in this world, right? So essentially, you will always have the poor, et cetera, right? That kind of logic. And he's writing to say, if ministers, instead of being apologists of wrongdoers, would emulate the example of the master they profess to serve and denounce sin in high places, no distinction between the mechanic and the millionaire, would preach the simple story of the cross, the evangelization of the world would soon be accomplished. Yes, so I'm going to move on to I should say actually, because I have brought these two books and I've mentioned both of them, they make very different arguments. And this is sort of one of the key things that I hope to express is the fact that you can use the same set of facts as a historian, right, to come to different conclusions. And so you're free to come to a different conclusion about what I'm saying today, and I hope that if you do, that comes up in the discussion. Union Made is essentially making the argument that that the laborers, like I said, they sort of push clergymen in order to embrace what will come to be known as the social gospel, which I'll talk about in a moment. What Drake is talking about is saying, yes, but it didn't actually have an impact, and the ministry was so much more powerful, essentially, that they were able to undermine this entire labor movement, right? So in some ways, you would see this as sort of a more optimistic book and a more pessimistic book, depending on your perspective, I suppose. Okay, so maybe I'll talk about the slide first, and then no, I think I'll talk about Washington Gladden as a person first. So the traditional way in which this movement called the social gospel is taught is that somebody like Washington Gladden, who was, he started out his ministry in Brooklyn. He moved, he was ordained in 1870. He moved to Springfield, Massachusetts. and was the minister there between 1878 and 1885. No, 1875 and 1882 maybe. In any case, sometime during this time period. And like I was saying, this was a moment in American labor relations where there was a lot of conflict. And so he sort of starts to see this in Springfield and becomes very interested in it. Writes a number of influential books and articles. Probably the most well-known and most influential, maybe, is a book called Applied Christianity. And as you can as is implied in the title, it's this idea that our Christian faith calls us, I shouldn't say us, since I'm Jewish, but Christian faith calls people to have an active role in the world, right? To try to improve the world. I mean, the sermon today was largely making the same point, right? And so Gladden becomes this major figure within the church and within Congregationalism in particular. At first, his ideas are sort of rejected out of hand, but more and more people come to agree with him. And eventually, in 1904, he becomes elected the moderator for the National Council of Congregationalist churches. That's not the exact name, but it's close. So Gladden is this huge figure, and in the traditional way of teaching the social gospel, you would focus initially on Gladden, and then you would talk about other figures like Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Baptist minister and sort of, to some degree, a generation after Gladden. You would talk about Josiah Strong, the person who wrote Our Country. He was also part of this movement. And what these books are sort of trying to argue, that I was mentioning before, is that maybe you should focus more on kind of the bottom-up perspective, right? The fact that that the congregants were pushing the ministers in a particular direction, right? They were noting the fact that, for example, that they felt unwelcome in churches, right? Ministers were getting paid 10 times as much as they were getting paid. You had to pay to, there was a system of pew rents, right, where you would have to actually pay a certain amount of money to sit in certain pews, right? And the better pews paid more, right? And so consequently, you were literally put in your place if you couldn't afford to pay for a good seat in the church. So what this image is of is the head here is John D. Rockefeller. The man with the sword here is Washington Gladden, right? And so it says Dr. Gladden on the side here. John D. Rockefeller is at the bottom. And the title is Hard to Scalp, All Right, All Right. This is also from 1905 and is also related to the same event that I was referring to before, which was a donation that John D. Rockefeller made to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which we are going to turn to in just a moment. Gladden responded to this with outrage. And it became known as the tainted money controversy. And that is a reference to an article that Gladden had published 10 years earlier, that a quote of which I have on the screen here, where he writes, "In the cool brutality with which properties are wrecked, securities destroyed, and people by the hundreds robbed of their little all to build up the fortunes of the multimillionaires, we have an appalling revelation of the kind of monster that a human being may become. Is this clean money? Can any man, can any institution, knowing its origin, touch it without being defiled?" Right? And so what he's bringing up then 10 years later is, and I think I have a quote later on, specifically to the controversy, but what he's saying is, if the money itself is tainted, has that tainted the organization that accepts it? and that tries to put it towards some sort of good use, right? And again, this will come up in a moment, but that's still an issue that we deal with today, right? And so one of the points that I want to make is that a lot of these issues are still issues that we are dealing with today. Another point, though, is this idea of congregationalism and whether the polity of congregationalism kind of helps, hinders, would have helped the situation in which congregations found themselves during this time period, right? Because those congregations where the sort of laborers felt unwelcome, the congregation was mostly kind of wealthy people, right, who were paying their minister fairly well, right? And so like together they were actually kind of were in agreement with one another. At the same time, if you think about the broader congregation, right, of Congregationalists within a city like Chicago or New York, wherever, right, there were people who were being excluded. And what you find during this period, which is an argument that Drake makes, is that increasingly these people, the laborers, turn towards more low church organizations where they have more of a voice, right? So like holiness movements where shouting out in church is perfectly acceptable, right? And even encouraged, where there's no such thing as pew rents. The people there are not dressed like I'm dressed today, et cetera, right? And so where they feel kind of more comfortable, right? And, Congregationalism in some ways is a forerunner for that, right? In the 17th, 18th century, right? And increasingly becomes more, starts to add organs to churches, starts to build fabulous buildings, et cetera. Right, but at its core, it's much more about the people coming together in church, right? Okay, I'm going to go fast through missions because the reason why I started with labor is that I know it less well, whereas missions I know quite well, and so I can kind of just like fly through this, and then I'm happy to answer questions about it during the discussion period, right? If you want me to kind of expound on anything. This is kind of the overview. Essentially, missionary ideology changes dramatically during this period. And I'm going to be focusing largely on the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, right? Because that's the foreign mission board for Congregationalists. There's also the Women's Board of Missions, which was auxiliary, that was the word that they used, to the American Board. But that was a board that was founded in 1868, I believe, in order to essentially promote single women missionaries to go out into the world. There's lots to say about women in missionaries. Sort of the same, to some degree, the same idea as expressed before about how women have been the backbone of the mission movement as well. But we can talk about that more in the discussion period. What was preventing that up until 1868 was more or less this man, Rufus Anderson. Anderson was hugely important for the American Board. He was in charge of it for decades and decades, including the period through the Civil War until he retired in 1867. And he had this idea of the three self model, basically that churches would be self-supporting, self-propagating is the third one. Self-governing, thank you. Yes. So self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating, right? And because of that, his view was that essentially missionaries should go out into the world and just preach the gospel, right? Because once you got to that point of that churches could support themselves, govern themselves, and propagate themselves, it would just flow from there, right? You wouldn't need to teach things like, physics, etc. You wouldn't need to send farmers out to teach agriculture, etc., right? In some ways, this sounds remarkably modern, right? There's this the idea of like American missionaries going out and educating the foreigner, right? Seems very kind of imperialistic. That wasn't Anderson's thought at all, right? I mean, it was much more about the word will spread on its own, right? Let's have confidence that the word of God will spread. We don't need to do anything else. So the next person that I'll talk about is Grace Kimball. Grace Kimball is somebody that I want to bring up partly because of the fact that she is a woman. She was sent to the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s by the Women's Board of Mission. She came back to the United States to get her medical degree. She became a doctor. She went back to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire refused to grant her license to practice medicine. But she stayed there through into the 1890s. And if you know about Ottoman history, you'll know that between 1894 and 1896, the Ottoman Empire had one of these periodic periods where they massacred Armenian people, right? Culminated obviously in the Armenian genocide, but in the 1890s there was another period like this, and she served the American board, served via the Women's Board of Mission during this time period, and she set up these industrial schools basically to help Armenian people create a support network to make money so that they could essentially survive. She's important for a variety of reasons, one of which is this is obviously very much against what Rufus Anderson is going for. Rufus Anderson was also opposed to the idea of single women becoming missionaries. And so she's an example of a single woman going out and becoming a missionary, and a doctor. That's another important thing to note, is the fact that missions offered women opportunities that they could not otherwise have within the United States. Women could be doctors in this time period, but it tended to have to be more confined, right, to like women's health issues, right? Whereas in Turkey, she was able to do all sorts of medicine, right? So there were lots of opportunities there. James Barton, Mike has read my dissertation, so he's heard a lot about James Barton, and so I won't bore you with too many details about him. But he was a leader of the American Board in the early 20th century and late 19th century. The main thing that I want to note about him is that he promoted this idea of the modern missionary, which is sort of the last quote from Grace Campbell was essentially saying that we are doing doctoring, we are doctors in the field, but primarily we are missionaries, right? Barton takes it even one step further, where he wants to find any avenue in order to help people. He's not, that kind of implies he's a heroic figure. I'd say he's a kind of complicated figure. But he helps found this organization that becomes Near East Relief, which is directly responding to the Armenian genocide and really trying to find some way to save people's lives and to help them. And it's outside, though, now of the bounds of the church, right? This is more one of these organizations that's like bringing together missionaries and church leaders, but also Catholic leaders, also rabbis, trying to promote some cause, right? And that's not a rejection of the church, right? It's a way of saying that some things are best done in the church and other things are best done in partnership with other people. Okay. Again, I'm getting close to the end here. I just want to talk about missionary impact abroad and then missionary impact at home, and then I'll show you one more slide and then we'll have time for some discussion. Essentially, missionary impact abroad in the past, the ways that historians have talked about missions has been largely either as a heroic story or as in one of, like, essentially imperialism, right? And increasingly, both sides have sort of moved more towards the middle. And so where that's coming from is saying that the people with whom missionaries interacted were not just like a blank slate for missionaries to draw whatever they wanted on, right? They had an interest in their interactions with the missionaries too. And sometimes that interest was, I don't want this at all. And other times it was like, I want some of this and not all of it. And other times it was like, I'm fully on board with everything that you're saying, right? So one of the best articles that I know about this is by this person named Walima Kalusa, which is about Zambia. And it's about medical missionaries in Zambia. And what happened was the medical missionaries had trouble learning the language. It was a complicated language. And so they relied on local people to translate the medical information to them, right? And obviously they were sort of assuming that the people were translating it word for word, exactly like I was saying, right? And of course that was not at all the case. But it was so much not the case that actually what they were doing was they were using local understandings of medicine and of the body and of superstition, religious belief, etc., in order to make the same point that the doctors were trying to make, right? And so in actuality, what was happening here was this really interesting melange of Western medical knowledge, Western Christian belief with African indigenous understandings, right? And increasingly, that's our understanding of how missions operated in the world, where it was a lot of translation, a lot of give, sometimes take, sometimes not, etc. And this article by Gao Ji is sort of making a similar point about medicine in China, and so hence the picture. Missionary impact at home. I'm going to skip this particular slide and talk about this slide. This is an image of John Hersey. You may have read his book Hiroshima, which is fairly well known. He also won the Pulitzer Prize for literature. Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, wow. Cool. That was not at all why I picked him. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's not at all why I picked it. The reason I picked him was that he was the son of missionaries in China. So there's lots to say about the impact of the mission movement on the United States. One of the most interesting arguments has been made recently by David Hollinger in this book called Protestants Abroad, where he more or less says that cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism in the United States is largely thanks to missionaries and their kids having experiences elsewhere in the world and bringing back those experiences and shaping their understanding of the United States, right? And of the way that the United States ought to interact in the world. And there's all sorts of examples of this, missionaries and missionary kids working for the OSS, which became the CIA, founding all sorts of schools that taught other religions in the world, taught languages, etc. And so really kind of imbuing a knowledge of the world in the United States. And he's focusing especially on the period sort of right after the end of the period that I'm focusing on, right? And so essentially the missionaries that I'm talking about, they're kids, like John Hersey. So Mike specifically asked me, I'm not actually going to do the conclusion because I want to have a discussion, but Mike specifically asked, I think, for me to include this image here, because I do think that it actually expresses a sort of a key point. which is the way that this, first of all, I write Money Matters here. My work is really on fundraising and in the mission movement and in philanthropy. And this is actually telling of the way that churches tried to sell missions to congregations, right? So each one of these blocks represents $7.5 million. And at the top here is one block for foreign missions. And at the bottom is this massive amount of money that's spent on liquor, right? So this is liquor, tobacco, jewelry, church work, confectionery, millinery hats, chewing gum, right? So chewing gum is getting more money than foreign missions. Right, and that's saying that this pyramid, they're saying that this pyramid, maybe it's not entirely upside down. I don't think that they would say that necessarily that foreign missions work should get more money than church work, but clearly they're saying that something is wrong in society here, right? And so the quote that I was referring to before by Washington Gladden about tainted money is the one that's over on the side here, where he's saying that money can't be redeemed by doing good, which I think is actually a question. But with that, I'm going to stop, and I apologize for going over a little bit because I really want to have some discussion and Q&A.